I thought you were dead. The words came from somewhere behind me. And almost at the exact same moment, a champagne glass slipped from the hand of a man standing near the drink table. Crash. The sound of shattering glass brought the entire backyard to a standstill. A kid dropped his ice cream onto the grass. Someone pushed back their chair and stood up. Country music was still drifting from the speaker on the patio, but nobody was listening anymore. Every eye had locked onto the same spot, me, and the man who had just dropped the glass. Nobody touched a fork, nobody said a word. Even Rick looked like he'd forgotten how to blink. My stomach tightened, because I recognized him immediately. Walter Briggs, former Navy SEAL. The last time I'd seen him was in Afghanistan, 20 years ago. Walter stared at me like he'd just seen a ghost. No, the word barely left his mouth. No damn way. The color drained from his face. His hand was still shaking. Then he looked directly at me. Hades? My entire body went rigid. I hadn't heard that name in almost 20 years. Nobody in my family knew it. Nobody in Texas knew it. Hell, most of the people I served with didn't use that nickname anymore. But Walter knew, and one look at his face told me something else. He remembered everything. Wait a second. Rick blinked, looked at me, looked at Walter, then back at me again. You know her? Nobody answered. Walter started walking toward me, slowly, one step at a time. The entire party followed him with their eyes. I heard a beer can being set down on a table, a chair scraping across the deck, someone whispering, "What's going on?" Walter stopped, right in front of me. His eyes were red now. Then he straightened his posture and saluted, right there in the middle of Aunt Donna's 75th birthday party. Not a casual salute, not a joke, a real one. The kind of salute that means something to people who've worn the uniform. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Rick wasn't smiling anymore. Aunt Donna stood frozen beside the birthday cake. And for the first time all afternoon, even I didn't know what to say. Walter swallowed hard. "I thought you were dead." He said it again. This time, he said it loud enough for everyone to hear. And I swear, for a second, you could hear the wind moving through the trees behind the house. 6 hours earlier, I'd been standing in my little kitchen outside Temple, Texas, car keys in one hand, trying to decide whether I was actually going to show up to this party. The coffee maker clicked and hissed on the counter. Duke was asleep by the back door. The old dog's leg twitched every now and then while he dreamed. I checked the clock, then looked at the peach cobbler sitting on the kitchen table. Aunt Donna had called me 3 days earlier. "You coming?" That was it. No guilt trip, no pressure, just a question. She'd always been like that. Maybe that's why I never figured out how to say no to her. I don't hate my family. I know that probably sounds strange when I tell you I skipped almost every family gathering for 8 years. But the truth is, after a long enough time, you get used to the quiet, and crowds become a lot harder than people think. I like mornings on my porch, watering my tomatoes, listening to birds instead of making small talk. I don't spend much time thinking about the past anymore. At least that's what I kept telling myself. By the time I got to Waco, everything was exactly what I expected. The smell of brisket smoking on the grill, kids running through the yard, a bunch of men arguing about football, women catching up on grandchildren and family news. And of course, there was Rick. Rick was the kind of guy who could turn 10 seconds of silence into a 5-minute speech. The second he saw me getting out of my truck, he yelled across the yard, "Well, look who finally showed up." Heads turned. I was starting to think the government still had you locked away in Area 51. The laughter came right on cue. I laughed too. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes it's easier to laugh along than explain yourself. Around 4 o'clock, Walter Briggs arrived. Aunt Donna introduced him as an old friend of her late husband, former Navy SEAL. He shook hands, made small talk, calm, polite, easygoing, until his eyes landed on me. Looking back now, that should have been my first clue. I should have known. But I'd spent so many years with the past sitting quietly where I left it. I never imagined it could still walk into a backyard barbecue. I definitely never imagined that a few hours later, one forgotten nickname would make a man who'd survived a war drop a glass right out of his hand. Before I tell you what happened next, I'm genuinely curious. If you were Rick that afternoon, And if you just watched a retired Navy SEAL snap to attention and salute the cousin everyone had always considered the quiet one, what would you think? There has to be some kind of mistake. B. I'd immediately want to know who she really is. C. I'd realize I may have completely misjudged someone. Drop an A, B, or C in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Because trust me, the thing that made Walter Briggs go pale that afternoon wasn't the nickname Hades. It was what came with it. A sandstorm, a helicopter, a distress signal, and one night in Afghanistan when a whole lot of people believed I wasn't coming home. And the truth is, that was only the beginning of the story. 6 hours before Walter Briggs dropped a champagne glass in Aunt Donna's backyard, I was standing alone in my little kitchen outside Temple, Texas. If I'd decided to stay home that morning, if I'd called and said I was busy, if I'd used any one of the dozens of excuses I'd relied on over the years, Walter never would have found me, and this story probably would have ended before it ever began. But I didn't know that then. At the time, I was just trying to decide whether I had enough courage to attend a family birthday party. The coffee maker rattled softly on the counter. Duke was asleep by the back door. The old dog's leg twitched every now and then in his sleep. Outside, the sprinkler system had just kicked on. Rows of tomato plants swayed gently in the morning sun. That was the kind of morning I liked. Quiet, predictable, no surprises. After a while, you learn to appreciate predictable things. I poured myself another cup of coffee, then glanced toward the bookshelf across the room. The photo was still there, me and David, standing beside Lake Travis, both of us smiling like life was always going to stay that simple. The picture was still there. I just stopped turning it face down. I looked at it for a few seconds, then looked away. Not because it hurt, but because there are some memories you eventually learn to live beside. You don't fix them. You don't explain them. You just let them exist. My phone buzzed on the kitchen table. A text from Rick. I opened it. Don't disappear this year. Don't disappear this year. A laugh escaped me. Then another message came through almost immediately. Donna says $10 says you bail. I laughed again, and almost instantly, I hated the fact that I had. That was Rick. Even when he was trying to be nice, it somehow still sounded like he was making fun of you. 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. Aunt Donna, I answered. You still thinking about it? I laughed. You tracking me now? No, she didn't miss a beat. But I know you. I leaned against the kitchen counter, listening to Duke snore softly on the floor. I just want to see you. That was all she said. No pressure, no guilt, no lecture. She didn't ask why I'd missed so many family gatherings over the years. She simply wanted to see me, and somehow, that was always harder to say no to than an argument. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a few more minutes, listening to the refrigerator hum, listening to the sprinklers outside, listening to the old clock in the living room ticking away 1 second at a time. Then I looked at Duke. He looked back at me. No pressure, no judgment, just looking. Eventually, I let out a sigh, pulled the peach cobbler out of the refrigerator, wrapped it up carefully. Well, I said, looks like we're going to visit family. Duke opened one eye, then closed it again, completely unimpressed. Honestly, that was probably the smartest reaction in the house. The drive from Temple to Waco isn't very long, but it's long enough to think too much. Fields stretched out on both sides of the highway. Pickup trucks rolled past in the opposite direction. Small gas stations dotted the roadside, the same faded billboards I'd driven by hundreds of times before. I turned on the radio, made it through maybe 2 songs, then switched it off. The silence felt better. About halfway there, I started thinking about family. Not in a bitter way, just, I'd never really known where I fit during those gatherings. Some people told stories. Some people made everybody laugh. Some people naturally became the center of every room. Me? I was usually the one sitting closest to the door, the one who left first, the one who talked the least. After enough years, everyone got used to that version of me, including me. When the Waco City sign finally came into view, I felt something familiar settle in my stomach. Not exactly anxiety, not exactly fear, more like that feeling you get right before walking into a room full of people you haven't seen in a long time. You don't know who's changed. You don't know who's still the same. And sometimes, You're not even sure which version of yourself is about to walk through the door. I turned onto the road leading to Aunt Donna's house. I could see the line of parked cars before I even got close. Music drifted across the neighborhood. The smell of smoked brisket hung in the air. The party was already in full swing. And somehow, I had a feeling the day wasn't going to be as ordinary as I hoped. At the time, I had no idea why. I didn't know Walter Briggs was on his way. I didn't know the name Hades was about to be spoken for the first time in nearly 20 years. And I definitely didn't know that before the sun went down. A man would look at me like he'd seen a ghost and say the one sentence I never expected to hear again. I thought you were dead. But before any of that happened, I still had to get out of the truck and deal with Rick first. And if you knew Rick, you'd understand why that alone already felt like a challenge. By the time I got out of the truck, Rick was already working on what I guessed was his third beer. At least that was my guess, because the grin on his face had reached that level only beer or excessive confidence can produce. Well, look who decided to show up. Rick lifted his can. Claire Donovan in the flesh. A few people turned. A few waved. I grabbed the peach cobbler and headed toward the backyard. Hey, Rick. I was starting to think you changed your phone number. I considered it. A few people laughed. Rick laughed the hardest. That was Rick. The kind of guy who could start a conversation with a stranger in a parking lot and know their dog's name 10 minutes later. The smell of brisket covered the entire yard. Smoke drifted lazily from the smoker behind the fence. Country music played from an old speaker near the porch. Kids ran around the picnic tables with melting ice cream dripping down their hands. Everything looked completely normal. And that's exactly why I liked afternoons like that. You look at them and think nothing memorable is about to happen. I heard you're still driving that old Ford. Rick fell into step beside me. Things still running? I think it'll outlive both of us. Laughter rippled around the table. Fair enough, Rick nodded. That truck could probably survive the apocalypse. About half an hour later, everybody was eating. The usual family conversations started making their rounds. Somebody was talking football. Somebody was complaining about grocery prices. One uncle was telling the same story he'd probably told 20 times already. I was standing near the back fence, glass of iced tea in my hand, enjoying one of the few quiet moments of the afternoon, when Rick showed up again. All right, serious question. I looked at him. That sounds dangerous. I mean it. That made me laugh. Because Rick usually said that right before asking something completely ridiculous. He leaned against the fence. What did you actually do in the military? I took a sip of tea. Worked, Rick grimaced. That might be the worst answer I've ever heard. I've had years to practice. A couple of people nearby laughed. No, seriously. Rick shook his head. What did you really do? A little bit of everything. Like what? I traveled, Rick pointed at me. You are an absolute nightmare for curious people. A voice spoke up from somewhere behind us, and the moment I heard it, something inside me went still. That never changed. I turned around. Walter Briggs. He was standing near the drink table, a champagne glass in one hand, his eyes fixed on me, and for some reason, I got the feeling he was trying to remember something. Rick immediately pulled him into the conversation. See what I mean? She's always been like this. I ask a question, and she answers like she's testifying before Congress. A few people laughed. Walter didn't. That caught my attention, because ever since he'd arrived, he'd been friendly with everyone, easygoing, relaxed, but now he was only looking at me. All right, let me ask this. Rick pointed his beer at me. Have you ever shot anybody? Yep. Been in a fight? Yep. What about a knife? Sometimes. Rick threw his hands up. See? That's not an answer. That's a movie trailer. I shrugged. Movies usually have bigger budgets. A few laughs rolled through the group. Walter still didn't smile. He was staring at me in a way that started to make me uncomfortable. Not afraid, not nervous. Just the feeling you get when someone is seconds away from remembering something they forgot a long time ago. I'd seen that look before, in hospitals, at veterans' reunions, in places where the past suddenly walks through the door without warning. Rick lifted his beer. All right. If you're so mysterious, he grinned. What was your military nickname? I didn't answer right away. The glass of iced tea felt cold in my hand, Barbecue smoke drifted across the yard. Kids laughed somewhere behind us. Everything still felt completely normal, until I opened my mouth. Hades. The second the word left my lips, my stomach dropped. I hadn't heard that name in almost 20 years. Walter froze. Not paused, not hesitated. Frozen. The smile disappeared from his face. He stared at me. Didn't blink. Hades? The word came out almost as a whisper. My stomach tightened. Nobody had called me that in nearly 2 decades. No. Walter slowly shook his head, like he was arguing with his own memory. No way. His eyes searched my face again, and then the color drained from it. Completely. Like he'd just seen something he never expected to see again. No damn way. The champagne glass slipped from Walter's hand, hit the wooden deck. Crash. The entire backyard went silent. A kid froze in the middle of the lawn. Someone slowly set down a beer can. A chair scraped across the deck somewhere behind us. Rick blinked twice, then a third time. What's going on? Nobody answered. Walter started walking toward me, slowly, one step at a time, and I felt my heartbeat pick up. Because by then, I knew. He remembered. Not Claire Donovan from Temple. Not the woman who brought a peach cobbler to a family birthday party. The person he remembered was someone else. Someone I had spent nearly 20 years trying to leave behind. Walter stopped in front of me. His eyes were red now. He straightened his posture, came to attention, and saluted. Right there in Aunt Donna's backyard. Nobody said a word. Not even Rick. I thought you were dead. Walter's voice cracked. I really thought you were dead. And in that moment, the backyard stopped feeling like a family barbecue. It became a doorway. One that led straight back to Afghanistan. To a place I'd spent almost 20 years trying not to revisit. If you've ever felt misunderstood, or carried a part of your past that almost nobody around you knows about, leave a in the comments. I read almost every one of them. And trust me, the thing that made Walter Briggs drop that glass was the nickname Hades. It was what came with it. A sandstorm, a distress call, a helicopter, and one night outside Kandahar when a lot of people believed I wasn't going to make it home. That was also the night everything started to change. I thought you were dead. Walter's voice was rough now, like the words had scraped their way out. I really thought you were dead. The entire backyard had gone silent. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was touching their food. Even Rick stood motionless. The beer can was still in his hand. But for the first time since I'd arrived, he didn't seem to know what to say. Walter slowly lowered his hand after the salute. His eyes never left mine. Then he shook his head. I can't believe this. A pause. I went to your memorial. The words hit me harder than I expected. A cold feeling ran straight through my chest. Aunt Donna covered her mouth. What? The word escaped before she could stop it. Walter didn't get anyone else. Only me. I heard reports that you didn't make it. I heard the helicopter never returned on schedule. I heard a dozen different stories. He swallowed. But nobody ever really knew what happened. Finally, Rick found his voice. Hold on. He looked around the table. What are we talking about? Walter pulled out a chair and sat down. The legs scraped against the deck. For a few seconds, he just looked at me, like he was asking permission. I gave the slightest nod, barely noticeable. Walter let out a breath. Then he said a single word. Kandahar. Nobody reacted, except me. Just one word. But it was enough to pull me 20 years backward. The first thing that told me something was wrong was the silence. Not gunfire, not explosions. Silence. The radio should have been noisy, constant chatter, updates, arguments, questions. Instead, it stayed quiet for too long. I still remember looking over at the communications coordinator. He was staring at his screen. Nobody said anything, because everybody in that room knew the same thing. That kind of silence wasn't normal. Then the signal came through, a burst of static, a crackle, then a broken voice, weak, distant, almost gone before it arrived. The radio suddenly came alive. Then somebody started screaming, not in English, not clearly enough for anyone to understand, just screaming, raw, panicked, desperate. And then, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Nobody at the table said a word. Not even Rick. I think it was the first time all day he didn't have a joke ready. Walter stared down at the tabletop. His hand tightened around his water glass. He remembered. I knew he remembered. I still remember the smell of the fuel. The words came out before I really thought about them. I wasn't sure whether I was talking to Walter or to myself. The dust, the heat, the smell of something burning miles away. Rick slowly sat down. For the first time that afternoon, he set his beer aside, and for the first time all day, he was paying attention to something other than himself. Was it a rescue mission? One of my cousins finally asked. I shook my head. No, a pause. At least it wasn't supposed to be. Walter nodded. That's the problem. His voice was quiet. Some missions become something else the second you think you've figured them out. I looked out toward the field behind Aunt Donna's house. The sun was starting to drop lower, but in my head, I was looking at a completely different sky. A dull yellow one, full of dust, full of wind, full of things you never really forget. Then I remembered the voice, the one coming through the radio, so weak it was almost swallowed by the static, but I could still hear it, even now. I think they were praying. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Rick frowned. Praying? I nodded. At least that's what I thought. I couldn't understand what they were saying. I didn't know the language, but I know what hopeless sounds like. The backyard grew strangely quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. Walter took a slow breath. Then, for the first time since sitting down, he looked directly at Rick. You know what war movies never get right? Rick shook his head. Walter answered immediately. The waiting. Nobody interrupted. People remember the gunfire. They remember the explosions. But the thing that stays with you the longest is usually what comes before. He paused. The minutes when you know something terrible is about to happen. You just don't know what yet. I saw Rick swallow. The joking cousin was gone now. He wasn't looking at Walter like a stranger anymore. He was listening. Actually listening. Aunt Donna reached over and rested a hand on my arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Sometimes the people who love you know exactly when silence is the right thing to give. She just left her hand there, a small gesture, barely noticeable, but I knew exactly what she was trying to say. I'm here. I gave the slightest nod. Walter looked at me again. Something had changed in his expression, something beyond the memories, beyond Kandahar, beyond the mission itself. Finally he spoke, but that's not the part I never understood. The entire table turned toward him. Rick blinked. What do you mean? Walter didn't answer Rick. He kept his eyes on me. Only me. The part I never understood, he spoke slowly, carefully, was what happened after you came home. Something inside my chest sank, because I knew that question. Knew it very well. Walter leaned back in his chair. His voice grew quieter. Afghanistan wasn't the part that surprised me. He paused. The thing that surprised me, another pause, then he looked directly at me, was how you disappeared afterward. The backyard fell silent again. This time, the silence felt heavier, because I knew something none of them did. Afghanistan wasn't the hardest part of the story, not even close. The thing that truly changed my life was what happened after I came home. And that was the part I had never told my family. Not Aunt Donna, not Rick, not any of them. For 20 years they'd assumed the war was the story. The truth was, the war had only been the beginning. What came afterward was harder to explain, harder to survive. And in some ways, harder to leave behind. Afghanistan wasn't the part that surprised me. Walter's voice was quiet. The thing that surprised me, he looked directly at me, was how you disappeared afterward. The backyard went silent again. I looked down at my glass of iced tea. Most of the ice had already melted. Because Walter was right, Afghanistan wasn't the hardest part of the story. The hardest part was coming home. I didn't disappear because of Afghanistan. The words hung in the air. Rick frowned. What does that mean? I leaned back in my chair, looked out across the lawn behind Aunt Donna's house. The kids were still running around. Their laughter drifted through the evening every now and then. A completely ordinary scene. But when I think about coming home, the memory that hits me first isn't dramatic. It's not a battlefield. It's not a helicopter. It's not even Kandahar. It's a perfectly normal night. 2:17 a.m. I still remember the exact numbers glowing on the microwave clock. I was standing alone in the kitchen. The light above the sink was on, a glass of water in my hand. The house was completely quiet. David was asleep upstairs, but I couldn't sleep. I'd checked the front door 3 times, checked the windows twice, and somehow I still felt like something was wrong. There were no gunshots, no alarms, no war, just a kitchen in Texas. but my body didn't understand that. Rick slowly set down his beer for the first time all afternoon. He didn't interrupt, didn't crack a joke, didn't try to lighten the mood. He just listened. I thought it would get better. I stared out at the darkening field. I thought once I got home, everything would be over. Walter nodded slowly. He understood. I knew he did. But even that wasn't what made me disappear. Not the insomnia, not the memories, not the panic attacks. It was a man. Daniel Mercer. Walter went completely still. I noticed it immediately. Aunt Donna didn't. Rick didn't. But Walter did. And that told me more than I wanted to know. Mercer? Rick looked between us. Who's that? Walter let out a short laugh. Not because anything was funny. The kind of laugh people make when they've just realized the story is about to get a lot worse. Oh, he shook his head. Now it makes sense. And suddenly every person at that table was paying attention. Because for the first time all evening, the story wasn't about the war anymore. It wasn't a happy laugh. Not even close. The man who should have been sitting in front of the investigation board. Walter shook his head. Instead of Claire. The backyard went quiet again. Rick looked back and forth between us. Hold on. His forehead creased. You were investigated? I nodded. For almost a year. Why? Because I was the one who came back. The words hung in the air, and somebody had to take the blame. Daniel Mercer was the kind of man who understood exactly how systems worked. When things went well, everyone wanted credit. When things went wrong, someone needed to be responsible. Mercer understood that better than most, maybe too well. He signed the final report. Walter stared down at the table, and he knew. His voice dropped. I always knew he knew. Rick blinked. Knew what? Walter looked at him. Claire didn't do anything wrong. Nobody spoke. For a moment, even the wind seemed to disappear. Mercer kept getting promoted, kept collecting awards, kept showing up in photographs with important people. The same month, I hired a lawyer. He was accepting another commendation. Meanwhile, I was paying legal bills, answering investigators, explaining things that never should have needed explaining. And then my marriage started coming apart. Not because of one giant fight, not because of betrayal, because of smaller things, quieter things. The kind you don't notice until they're everywhere. One morning, I came downstairs. David had already left for work. There was a note sitting on the kitchen counter. Love you. Just 2 words. David left a note. I stood there staring at it far longer than I should have, because I honestly couldn't remember the last meal we'd eaten together. The realization hit me so suddenly it almost felt physical. I picked up the note, ran my thumb across the familiar handwriting, and for the first time, I understood the scariest thing about a marriage. It's not the moment it ends. It's the moment you realize you can't remember exactly when it started slipping away. Aunt Donna slowly covered her mouth. Walter stared at the ground. Rick wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the beer can sitting in front of him, like he was trying to rearrange everything he thought he knew. Because the quiet cousin, the woman who always left family gatherings early, the woman everyone assumed just liked being alone, was starting to sound like someone none of them had ever really known. A year later, I stared down into my glass. David put divorce papers on the kitchen table. Nobody asked what kind of papers. They already knew. I don't blame him. And I meant that. He tried. A pause. He really tried. I swallowed. But some people come home from war. I looked down at the melting ice in my tea. I'm not sure I ever really did. The backyard fell silent again. If I'm being honest, I think that's when I started disappearing. Not from the military. Not from Texas. From people. A little at a time. Year by year. Walter leaned back in his chair, and Mercer never apologized. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A short laugh escaped me. No. I shook my head. Not once. Walter looked away. I had a feeling he was trying very hard not to say what he was really thinking. This time it was Rick who spoke. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. So he still lives in Texas? I looked at him, then nodded. Yeah. Less than an hour from here. The atmosphere around the table changed instantly. Everyone felt it, because for the first time, Daniel Mercer wasn't just a name from an old story anymore. He was real. Living somewhere nearby, breathing the same air, driving the same roads. Close enough to find. Before I keep going, if you've made it this far into the story, leave a in the comments. And if you didn't like the video, hit the like button anyway. I know that sounds backwards, but it still makes me laugh every time. And honestly, thank you for being here. Because what happened next was the first time I'd seen Daniel Mercer in almost 20 years. And trust me, that meeting did not go the way any of us expected. At the time, I had no idea. I didn't know that less than 24 hours later, I'd be standing face to face with the man who changed the course of my life. And this time, he wouldn't be hiding behind an investigation report, or a stack of paperwork, or a polished title on an office door. This time, he'd be standing right in front of me. At the time, I had no idea. In less than 24 hours, I would see Daniel Mercer for the first time in nearly 2 decades. And this time, he wouldn't be hiding behind a report. The next morning, I almost didn't go. I mean that. I stood on my front porch with a cup of coffee in my hand. Duke was stretched out beside my chair. A light breeze moved through the tomato plants behind the fence. A completely ordinary Texas morning, the kind I liked. No surprises, no memories. No Daniel Mercer. My phone buzzed. Walter? I stared at the screen for a few seconds before answering. You home? Yeah? You coming tonight? I sighed. No. Walter was quiet for a moment. Figured. I don't need to see him. I know. I don't need to hear whatever excuse he has. I know. And I definitely don't need answers. This time Walter laughed, a small one. You're still letting him rent space in your head. I didn't answer. Mostly because I hated how right he was. By 6 that evening, I was there, Austin Veterans Memorial Center. The parking lot was almost full. Pickup trucks, American flags, men in suits, veterans wearing unit pins and service ribbons. I nearly turned around twice. Seriously, twice. But somehow I walked inside anyway. Walter was standing near the entrance. The second he saw me, he smiled. Knew you'd show up. I hate when you're right. Me too. That got a laugh out of me, and honestly, I needed that laugh. We had barely stepped into the main hall when I saw him. Daniel Mercer. Not because I was looking for him. People like Mercer don't have to be found. They're always standing in the middle of the room. He was surrounded by sponsors and donors, laughing loudly, telling some story. Everyone around him hanging on every word. And for a second, it felt like 20 years had never happened. Same posture, same confidence, same ability to make people believe whatever version of the story he wanted them to hear. My stomach tightened, not from anger, not even from fear. Something stranger than that. The realization that a person can change the direction of your entire life and keep living theirs as if nothing ever happened. Then Mercer turned his head and saw me. The smile disappeared first, just for a second. So fast most people would have missed it. I didn't, because I was watching, and for the first time that evening, Daniel Mercer looked like a man who had just seen something he thought he'd left behind a long time ago. Just like before. 20 years. 20 years is long enough for hair to turn gray, long enough for backs to stiffen, long enough for faces to collect a few more lines. But apparently, not long enough to forget. I recognized him instantly. And then, Mercer saw me. The smile disappeared first, then everything else. The moment lasted maybe a second, probably less, but I still remember it perfectly. The man standing next to him was saying something. Mercer didn't hear a word. A woman touched his arm. He didn't react. His eyes locked onto mine. I saw it. Walter saw it too. He leaned slightly toward me and spoke under his breath. That's the face of a man who just saw something he never expected to see again. I didn't answer, because I was thinking the exact same thing. Mercer excused himself from the group, then started walking toward us. Slowly. Controlled. Professional. The same polished confidence I remembered. But underneath it, I saw something else. He was tense. Very tense. Claire Donovan. He stopped in front of me. I didn't expect to see you here. That makes 2 of us. Mercer blinked. Walter looked away. I had a feeling he was trying not to laugh. You look well. Mercer offered the kind of smile politicians practice in mirrors. I could say the same thing. I tilted my head slightly. But then one of us would be lying. Walter coughed. A little too suddenly. Definitely hiding a laugh this time. Mercer didn't smile. Nobody did. The air between us felt like a wire stretched too tight. Perhaps we should talk privately. His voice dropped lower, more careful now. I held his gaze. You said that exact same thing 20 years ago. The change in his eyes was immediate. There it was. A direct hit. I knew it the second I saw his expression. A few people nearby started paying attention. One of the donors glanced over. A local reporter looked up from his phone. Mercer noticed. Of course he did. Men like Daniel Mercer always notice when the room starts watching, and for the first time since he walked over, he looked less like the man in control, and more like someone trying very hard not to lose it. Maybe we're only hearing one side of this. Rick said it quietly, but he said it, and the room got uncomfortable fast. Walter turned toward him. So did I. Rick lifted a shoulder. I'm just saying. A pause. It's been 20 years. Mercer didn't say a word, but for the first time that evening, I saw him relax. Just a little. Like somebody had finally stepped onto his side of the line. Right then, the lights in the ballroom began to dim. The program was about to start. Mercer looked at me for a few more seconds, then leaned closer, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. Some things should stay buried. I held his gaze. You already tried that. Mercer didn't answer. He turned and walked away. A few minutes later, everyone took their seats. Mercer stepped onto the stage. Applause rolled across the room. The MC introduced him as a leader, a servant of the nation, a voice for veterans. Walter sat beside me. He didn't clap. Neither did I. Mercer began speaking. He was good at it. He'd always been good at it. Calm voice, confident posture, perfect timing. He knew exactly when to pause for applause, exactly when to lower his voice, exactly how to make a room trust him. Then suddenly, his eyes drifted toward our table. Just for a second, but long enough. There are memories, Mercer said from the stage, that change over time. The ballroom remained quiet. He continued. There are people who remember events differently from what actually happened. Walter went still. So did I. Because I knew exactly what he was doing. He was telling the same story, the same lie. After all these years, only now he was doing it under spotlights, in front of donors, veterans, reporters, people willing to believe him, the way they always had. But there was one major difference. 20 years ago, I was sitting alone. This time, I wasn't. Walter looked at me. I looked back, and I realized he was thinking the exact same thing I was. Because across the ballroom, a few people had started recognizing me. An older man suddenly pushed back his chair and stood. Then another veteran turned around, looking toward our table. Then another, and another. Small reactions. Easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but Walter saw them. So did I. And in that moment, Daniel Mercer still had no idea the people who had been in Kandahar that night were sitting in this room too. And some of them were beginning to remember exactly what happened. People remember what they need to remember. Mercer delivered the lines smoothly, like he'd practiced it, like he'd said versions of it for years. The room stayed quiet, but it wasn't agreement anymore. It was tension, the kind that settles over a crowd right before something breaks. Tom Henderson nodded slowly. That's true. His voice carried farther than I remembered. Older, rougher, but still steady. Problem is, Tom glanced toward me. Some of us remember the same thing. A murmur moved through the ballroom. Mercer's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. Walter didn't. Tom took another step into the aisle. I remember the radio traffic. He pointed toward me. I remember who got us out. The room grew even quieter. You remember too. Tom wasn't talking to Mercer anymore. He was looking past him, toward the audience, toward the veterans scattered throughout the room. A man near the back slowly stood. Then a woman wearing an old unit pin. Then another veteran. And another. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just people standing because the truth had suddenly entered the room, and they were tired of sitting down. Mercer's eyes moved across the crowd, counting, recognizing faces, realizing who was there. For the first time that evening, I saw uncertainty. Real uncertainty. Not the polished kind politicians fake, the genuine kind. The kind that appears when a carefully maintained story starts falling apart. Let's not do this, Mercer forced a smile. This is supposed to be a night honoring service. Tom laughed, a short, humorless laugh. Exactly. Another veteran stood, silver hair, cane in one hand. That's why we're doing it. Mercer's expression changed again. Because suddenly it wasn't Tom. It wasn't Walter. It wasn't me. It was becoming impossible to dismiss everyone. The ballroom no longer felt like an awards banquet. It felt like a courtroom. And Mercer knew it. He looked toward the exits, toward the reporters, toward the donors, toward the veterans who had started turning their chairs around. Then his eyes found mine again. For 20 years. I'd imagined what this moment might feel like. Anger, vindication, relief. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Because the strange thing about carrying something for that long is that eventually it becomes part of you. And standing there, watching Daniel Mercer lose control of the room he'd spent years learning how to control, I realized something. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about the truth. And for the first time in 20 years, the truth wasn't sitting alone. Especially after 20 years. A few people nodded. Mercer saw it. And for the first time since Tom stood up, he looked like he thought he was getting the room back. Then, Tom hit him. Hard. Good thing I brought the report. The words landed like a hammer. The ballroom went dead silent. Mercer didn't move, not even a little. Tom's voice remained calm. I kept it. He reached into a worn leather folder. And you know the most interesting part? He paused. Just for a second, but the entire room was waiting. You signed it. Silence. Absolute silence. Tom, Mercer started. Tom didn't let him finish. You signed the report. He pointed directly at the stage. You signed it. Another pause. Then he delivered the part that mattered. And you knew. The air seemed to leave the room. For the first time all night, Daniel Mercer didn't have an answer ready. A woman stood up on the right side of the ballroom, early 70s. Silver hair. An old purse clutched tightly in her hands. I'd never seen her before. But the moment I saw the photograph she was holding, I knew. Michael. The breath left my lungs. Michael. 22 years old, always talking about his little sister, always carrying a photograph in his chest pocket, a kid who had been far too young to end up in a war zone. The woman looked at me, her eyes already wet. I'm Michael's mother. For a moment, I had no idea what to say. None. She carefully pulled the photograph from her purse. It was Michael, standing beside a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8, both of them smiling. He carried this picture everywhere. Her voice shook, even overseas. My throat tightened instantly, because I remembered that picture. I remembered him showing it to anyone willing to listen. I remembered him promising he'd be home for her birthday. I remembered him talking about teaching her to drive someday. The woman held the photograph against her chest. Then she looked toward Daniel Mercer. Not angry, not loud. Somehow that made it worse. Mr. Mercer? The entire ballroom turned toward her. My son died believing the truth would matter. A pause. You told us Claire was responsible. Mercer swallowed. The first visible crack all evening. The woman looked back at me, then slowly shook her head. But every person who served with him told a different story. Now nobody in the room was looking at Mercer the way they had 20 minutes earlier. The applause was gone. The admiration was gone. And for the first time since stepping onto that stage, Daniel Mercer looked less like a celebrated leader, and more like a man running out of places to hide. I found it in his belongings. Her voice was barely holding together now. The ballroom was completely silent. I just wanted you to know. She tightened her grip on the photograph. He always said that if he ever made it home. Her voice broke. She stopped for a moment, then somehow finished the sentence. It would have been because of you. I lowered my head, not out of embarrassment, not out of shame, because I had finally run out of ways to stop the tears. Walter looked away. Tom wiped at his eyes. Even Rick, the same man who'd spent half the barbecue cracking jokes, sat completely still. Then someone stood, another veteran, then another, then another. Not all of them had been rescued by me. Not all of them even knew me personally, but they knew Kandahar. They knew that night, and they knew what had really happened. Mercer looked around the room. For the first time all evening, he wasn't the person everyone was looking up to. He was the person everyone was looking at. There's a difference, a big one. I think we should continue with the program. Mercer's voice sounded different now, less certain, less practiced. I think. He stopped, forgot where he was going, completely forgot. He adjusted his tie, then adjusted it again, like somehow that would help. It lasted only a second, but everyone saw it. Tom was the one who broke the silence. No. The word echoed through the room. I think. He looked directly at Mercer. Claire deserved the truth a long time ago. For the first time all night, Mercer looked at me, not like a subordinate, not like a name in a report, not like a problem that needed managing. He looked at the woman who survived, The woman he once believed would quietly disappear. The woman who refused to. And in his eyes, I didn't see authority. I didn't see confidence. I didn't see control. I saw something else. Something smaller. A man finally realizing that the story he'd been telling for 20 years didn't belong to him anymore. Because the witnesses were still here. The records were still here. The families were still here. And so was I. The truth had outlived his version of it. And for the first time since Kandahar, that truth was no longer standing alone. I thought I'd feel victorious. I thought there would be some sense of satisfaction. Some moment where everything finally balanced out. But the strange thing was, I mostly felt tired. Really tired. Because the hardest part was never Kandahar. And it wasn't Daniel Mercer either. The hardest part was carrying all of it for 20 years. The event ended earlier than scheduled. People gathered in small groups, talking quietly, looking at me, looking at Mercer, looking back again. Aunt Donna walked over. Her eyes were red. "Claire?" She stopped. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at her, then down at the floor. A few seconds passed. I honestly didn't know how to answer. "I don't know." My voice came out softer than I intended. Aunt Donna kept looking at me, waiting. I let out a slow breath, looked toward Walter, then Tom, then the people still standing around the ballroom. Maybe. The word caught in my throat. I swallowed. Because nobody ever asked. Nobody spoke. But I heard several people inhale at the same time. The kind of silence that happens when a truth lands harder than anyone expected. Aunt Donna stepped forward, wrapped her arms around me. She didn't say another word. She just held on. And strangely enough, that meant more than any apology ever could. Right before I left the ballroom, I glanced toward the stage. Mercer was standing there alone, for the first time in his life maybe. Completely alone. 3 days later, my phone rang. Unknown number. But I knew exactly who it was before I answered. Daniel Mercer. And for the first time in almost 20 years, he wasn't calling as a general. He wasn't calling as an investigator. He wasn't calling as a man protected by rank, titles, or reports. He was calling as a man who wanted to apologize. The strange thing is, for years, I thought that call would change everything. I imagined it. Rehearsed it. Wondered what I would say if it ever happened. But when my phone lit up with his name, I realized something. The apology wasn't the thing I'd been waiting for. Not anymore. Because somewhere between Kandahar, the investigation, the divorce papers, the years of disappearing, and that room full of people who finally knew the truth, something had changed. I wasn't carrying the story by myself anymore, and for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. I just wasn't brave enough to admit it. Mercer stared into his coffee. I read the report. I signed it. I looked at my career. He shook his head slowly, and I chose it. The space between us fell quiet. Dishes clattered somewhere behind the counter. Someone laughed at a nearby table. Life kept moving, while a 20-year-old war sat between us in a diner booth. I read your obituary. Mercer's voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought you were dead." A hollow laugh escaped him. Then I started hoping it was true. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. I know how awful that sounds. He rubbed his hands together. I know. But if you were still alive... He stopped, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. I would have had to live with what I'd done. Then he looked directly at me. "I spent 20 years hoping you would never walk into a room again." His voice was so quiet I almost missed it. "Because if you did..." He swallowed hard. "Everything would come back." That might have been the most honest thing I'd ever heard him say. I don't know if any of it was worth it. He stared out the diner window, the promotions, the medals, the speeches. A pause. "I still see Kandahar." Another pause. Every week. His jaw tightened. Sometimes every day. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Mercer looked at me and finally said the words. "I'm sorry." No excuses, no qualifications, no conditions, no if, no but. Just that. "I'm sorry." I sat there quietly. For years I'd imagined this moment. Hundreds of times, maybe thousands. But when it finally happened, it felt nothing like I'd imagined. "I don't hate you anymore." Mercer looked up, surprised, honestly surprised. That surprised me too. A small laugh escaped me, the first genuine one all morning. I looked down at my coffee, then back at him. "I think that's as close as I can get today." Mercer nodded. Like that answer was already more than he deserved, maybe more than he'd expected. The strange thing was, I thought an apology would feel like the ending, like a door finally closing, like something dramatic, something cinematic. Instead, it felt small, quiet, almost ordinary. Two older people sitting in a diner, talking about choices neither of them could undo, and somehow that made it feel more real. That was the moment I felt the most relief. Not because I won, not because he lost, but because I didn't have to keep having that conversation in my head anymore. A week later, Walter dragged me to a veterans meetup. I almost said no, out of habit, but I went anyway. Toward the end of the evening, a young soldier, maybe 22, 23, walked over. Dark circles under his eyes, shoulders tight. I recognized that look immediately. I'd seen it in the mirror. Do you ever stop thinking about it? I took a few seconds before answering. Then I shook my head. No. The kid looked down, like he'd expected that answer. But eventually, I glanced at the paper coffee cup in my hand. You stop thinking about it every day. He stood there quietly for a moment, then nodded. It was the first smile I'd seen from him all night, and strangely enough, that meant more to me than most of the medals I'd ever received. If you'd like to hear more about Claire, the years after Kandahar, the people she met, the stories she never told her family, leave a in the comments below. If enough people want to hear it, I'll keep telling her story. That night, I drove home. The Texas sky was turning orange along the horizon. Duke came running the second I pulled into the driveway. Just like always. I walked up onto the porch. The old wooden boards creaked beneath my boots. Crickets were already starting up in the fields beyond the fence. The refrigerator hummed softly inside the house. The tomatoes still needed watering. Nothing had changed. I made a cup of coffee, sat down on the porch. Duke settled at my feet. A light breeze moved across the yard. Nobody had called me Hades in years. And honestly, I was okay with that. The porch swing squeaked once. Somewhere across the field, a dog barked. Then everything went quiet again. I sat there listening to Duke breathe beside me, watching the last of the sunlight disappear beyond the fields. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence didn't feel like something I had to fight. It was just an ordinary evening. And strangely enough, that was enough. If any part of this story felt familiar, I think a lot of people here would understand yours too.